The phenomenology aims to help us understand modernity. And it's true that to do that, we do need to understand traditional forms of life, the ones we came from, and how we got here. And recollectively understanding modernity is the proper way to realize where we're committed to going from here, at least what would count as further progress. Nonetheless, Hegel resolutely keeps the narrative center of attention focused on the promises and perils of the still incomplete project of modernity. The motor of that project is the burgeoning significance of self-conscious individual subjectivity. A principal manifestation of that self-consciously new form of self-consciousness is the felt need for the theoretical legitimation of the norms by which moderns find themselves acculturated. The mere existence of inherited normative structures is no longer automatically accepted as sufficient warrant for them. Entitlement to the acquiescence of individuals to institutionalized constellations of authority and responsibility is conditioned on the provision of sufficient reasons justifying those arrangements to those subject to them. The demand for their theoretical legitimation is an important dimension along which, in modernity, the authority of normative statuses answers to the attitudes of those bound by the norms in question. The demand for the legitimation of authority is an aspect of the modern practical attitude dependence of normative statuses that doesn't, by itself, entail that the statuses in question are instituted by the attitudes. The latter, stronger claim, to which the reciprocal recognition model answers, asserts the sufficiency of attitudes for statuses. But conditioning the bindingness of statuses on attitudes, on their acknowledgement as legitimate by those whose attitudes they bind, asserts only a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. The fact that it's a hallmark of modernity that normative force is understood to depend on the possibility of a legitimating account, expressing a rationale for it, underlines a key feature characteristic of the modern form of Geist for Hegel. For it, language becomes the medium of recognition. Their specifically linguistic expression is now an essential aspect of recognitive attitudes of attributing and acknowledging normative statuses. Emphasis on characteristic means of linguistic expression was central all along in the book to Hegel's discussion of different forms of empirical self-consciousness on the side of cognition: indexicals and demonstratives for sense certainty, predicates and singular terms for perception, and subjunctively robust modal conditionals for understanding. And as it is for cognition, so it is for recognition. We saw that we saw earlier in the phenomenology, that behind and supporting the cognitive practices that embody and enact empirical consciousness lie the recognitive practices that embody and enact normative self-consciousness. Modern normative self-consciousness is articulated by recognitive attitudes and normative statuses that are what they are in significant part because of the language in which they're made explicit. In particular, we can understand the alienation from our norms that's inherent in modernity only in terms of the deformations of language that express it. It's an essential principled part of Hegel's general methodology to understand what's implicit in terms of its explicit expressions, to think of those expressions as essential to the identity of what's implicit. In this particular case, its specifically linguistic expressions are essential to alienation as a distinctively modern metaphysical normative structure. That's so precisely because alienation is at base a pathology of legitimation, undercutting the bindingness of norms. As such, it's rooted in the demand for a linguistically explicit account of the nature and rationale of the bindingness of the norms that make us what we are. The norms in question are discursive norms in that they're conceptually contentful. But the demand for explicit legitimation is further a demand for specifically discursive justification. The failure to reconcile the status dependence of normative attitudes with the attitude dependence of normative statuses has significant practical expressions, but its theoretical expressions are equally essential to the predicament. Language, Sprache, Hegel tells us repeatedly, is the Dasein of Geist, its concrete, immediate being. Modernity is the age of alienated Geist, and, quote, this alienation takes place in language, which here appears in its characteristic significance. In the middle section of the long Spirit chapter, Hegel accordingly addresses language, with particular attention to the language characteristic of alienation and the institutions that both foster that language and to which it's addressed. Hegel's discussion of the normative structure of the modern world, of culture, is long, intricate, and interesting, but our purposes don't require that I rehearse many of its details. He distinguishes two aspects of that structure: actual consciousness and pure consciousness. Actual consciousness comprises social institutions, the norms they embody, and individuals playing roles and engaging in practices governed and articulated by those norms. By applying those norms in practice, individual subjects make them actual and efficacious. They actualize the norms. The norms and the individuals acting and assessing their actions according to those norms collectively constitute the institutions, giving them, as well as the norms, actual existence. To act according to the norms is to appeal to those in one's practical deliberations about what to do. Similarly, to assess according to the norms is to appeal to those norms, the ones implicit in custom, as standards in assessing one's own and others' performance. Thus, for one's attitudes to be governed by the norms in the dual sense, that the norms provide standards for normative assessment of attitudes, and the norms are subjunctively sensitive to the content of the norms. The attitudes are subjunctively sensitive to the content of the norms. Hegel's term pure consciousness is a way of talking about how the norms are understood theoretically, their explicit discursive articulation. Hegel says that pure consciousness is both the thinking of the actual world and its thought form, its Denken und Gedachtsein. It's the way normativity is understood, the theory that makes explicit the normativity implicit in the institutionalized practices of actual consciousness. Pure consciousness is the way norms are conceived or conceptualized. Hegel's term for conceptual articulation, articulation by relations of material incompatibility and inference, is mediation. So he says that pure consciousness mediates the relation between actual individual selves and the norms that pure consciousness theorizes about. In traditional society, as opposed to modern culture, the norms implicit in Sitte, in customs, are immediate, not the subject of meta-level conceptualization or thematization, not made explicit, and hence not subject to critical scrutiny. Immediate Sittlichkeit has a purely practical, implicit, non-conceptual conception of norms, and so has no analog of pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is a distinctively modern form of self-consciousness, a manifestation of the rise of subjectivity. It's a new way the norms implicit in the practices of actual consciousness can be something explicitly for consciousness. Where actual consciousness requires the adoption of practical attitudes towards the norms, applying them in practice by judging, acting intentionally, and assessing the claims and performances of others, pure consciousness requires the adoption of theoretical attitudes towards the norms. In particular, pure consciousness offers explicit accounts of the nature of the binding force and the source of the content of the norms. It reflects on the relations between norms and the institutions that embody them, on the one hand, and the relations to the subjective normative attitudes of those whose practice they govern, on the other. Pure consciousness is a response to a felt need for the norms, their binding force, and their particular contents, not only to be explicitly understood and explained, but to be validated, legitimated, vindicated. That demand is itself a prime expression of the newly appreciated authority of self-conscious subjectivity and of its attitudes. The question at issue between traditional and modern practical conceptions and constellations of normativity is whether, when the individual acknowledges the norms in action and assessment, that needs to be conceptually mediated or not, whether a theory, a story about it, is needed. To say that it is to accord a new kind of authority to the attitudes of the individuals who produce, consume, and assess such legitimating stories. That's why the role in the world of culture of what Hegel calls pure consciousness is an essential part of the advent of modernity as the rise of subjectivity. And language is the medium in which the ultimately recognitive relations among self-conscious individuals, their acts and their normative attitudes, the norms they're bound by, the practices in which those norms are implicit, their communities and their institutions, are not only expressed, but instituted and instantiated. That's why the deformations in that recognitive constellation of attitudes, distinctive of alienation, takes the form of characteristic linguistic practices. In particular, Hegel thinks it takes the form of ironic relations between individuals and the culture constituting norms, which are viewed as something like pious fictions. Modernity is characterized by a one-sided focus on the normative significance of some of these elements at the expense of others. Paradigmatically, this is the privileging of the authority of individuals and their acts and attitudes, construing them as independent of and authoritative with respect to the norms they fall under. The very fact that language has come to the fore as the recognitive medium in which conceptual normativity is articulated offers some guidance as to how the one-sidedness of the modern appreciation of the significance of subjectivity, in the form of alienation, can be overcome, without having to give up the insight that marks the shift from traditional to modern culture as an expressively progressive transformation of our self-consciousness. It sets criteria of adequacy for an unalienated, postmodern form of recognition. For it means that our model for the articulation of Geist should be the relations among individual language users, their speech acts, the attitudes those speech acts express, linguistic norms, linguistic practices, linguistic communities, and languages. The move beyond modernity will require us to understand how the bindingness of objective conceptual norms is compatible with those norms being what makes particular desiring organisms into geistish, self-conscious individuals, and with those norms being instituted by the practices such individuals engage in of applying concepts in judgments and actions that express their commitments and other attitudes. Implemented practically, in actual and not just pure consciousness, that understanding will take the form of a move from the relations between individuals and their conceptually articulated norms exhibiting the alienated structure of irony to those exhibiting the structure of trust. And that's what I want to explain. There's a fundamental social division of normative labor corresponding to the division between force and content of speech acts. The force, Frege's Kraft, is the normative significance of a speech act, what difference it makes to the commitments and responsibilities the speaker acknowledges, undertakes, or licenses others to attribute. The content is what determines what one has committed oneself to or made oneself responsible for by performing a speech act with that content. The key point is that performing a speech act, expressing a linguistic attitude, such as a belief or an intention, involves coordinate dimensions of authority of the speaker concerning the claiming, the act, and responsibility with respect to what's claimed, the content. When we talk, making claims about how things are or expressing intentions as to how they shall be, there's always something that's up to each one of us and something that's not. It is up to each one of us which move we make, what concept we apply, what counter in the language game we play. And then it's not up to us what the significance of that is, given the content of what we said. So it is up to me whether I claim that the pen is made of copper, whether I play the copper counter that's in play in our practices. But if I do play it, I've bound myself by a set of norms. I've committed myself to things independently of whether I realize what I've committed myself to. In this sense, the normative status I've taken on outruns my normative attitudes. What I'm actually committed to need not coincide with what I take myself to be committed to. The linguistic Tat goes beyond the linguistic Handlung, the distinction that speech acts involve. If I say that the pen is copper, then whether I know it or not, I've committed myself to its melting at 1085 degrees C, because what I'm saying cannot be true unless that's true too. It is up to me whether I play the counter, make that move, invest my authority or normative force in that content. But then it's not up to me what I've committed myself to by it, what commitments I've ruled out, and what would entitle me to it. The normative significance of the move I've made, the boundary of the responsibility I've undertaken, is not up to me. It's a matter of the linguistic norms that articulate the concepts that I have chosen to apply. The conceptual norms determined by the content of the concept speakers apply in judgment and intention are administered by the linguistic community, which accordingly exercises an authority correlative to that of the speaker. Metallurgical experts know a great deal more than I do about what I've claimed, what I've committed myself to by calling the pen copper. Those to whom I'm speaking, those who attribute and assess my speech act, have a certain kind of privilege, the authority to keep a different set of books on its consequences than I myself do. It's important to Hegel that even expert audiences are not fully authoritative concerning the content. They don't determine the melting point of copper. That's a matter of how things are in themselves, which is not a matter of how things are for the experts or the rest of the community, any more than it's a matter of how things are for the speaker. The norms are not something that can simply be read off the attitudes of either. Hegel wants to reconstruct the objective representational dimension of discourse, what it is for there to be referents that are authoritative for our inferences, the noumena behind the phenomena, the realities behind the appearances, in terms of the recollective historical structure of discursive practice. One of the principal aims of the rest of the discussion here of Hegel's Spirit chapter is further to delineate the fine structure of the diachronic historical account of the relations between normative force and conceptual content. But the fact that there is a third pole of authority, besides that of the speaker in the linguistic community, should not be taken to minimize the authority that the community does exercise with respect to conceptual content. Further, if we ask how the term copper came to express the content that it does, so that assertions employing it have the normative significance they do, the story we tell is going to have to include the practices of the linguistic community in question, the acts the individual speakers have actually performed in concrete circumstances, and the assessments of the correctness or incorrectness of those performances that their fellow community members have actually made. Somehow, by using the expression copper the way we have, in concert with the uses that we've made of a whole lot of other expressions, we've managed to make the copper holder beholden to how it objectively is with copper. We've incorporated features of the world into the norms we collectively administer, instituting a sense of correctness according to which the correctness of our copper claims answers to the facts about copper. Judging and acting intentionally must be understood as the process of applying conceptual norms and as the process of instituting those norms. In terms we'll be concerned with further along, the first is the process of giving contingency the form of necessity, and the second, the process of incorporating contingency into necessity. As we'll see, the account of recollective rationality and the relations between normative statuses and attitudes that are instituted by the recollective phase of experience points the way to a postmodern form of recognition that overcomes ironic alienation. This is the recollective recognitive structure of trust. Hegel talks about the move from theoretical and practical application of categories of independence to categories of freedom, which corresponds to moving from meta-categories of Verstand to those of Vernunft. And he talks about these as giving us a conceptual apparatus for both, on the one hand, identifying ourselves as products of norms that incorporate features of the objective world, like what the melting point of copper is, and on the other hand, seeing our activity as having instituted those norms, the norms that make the fact potentially visible and expressible. Focusing on the linguistic character of modern recognitive processes, the practices of adopting specific recognitive attitudes, that is, of acknowledging and attributing conceptually contentful commitments, responsibilities, and licensing, provides a new perspective on the notion of freedom, which is characteristic of Vernunft. According to the Kantian framework that Hegel takes over, agency is thought of as a matter of what agents are responsible for. Agents and knowers are creatures who live and move and have their being in a normative space, creatures who can commit themselves, who can undertake and attribute responsibility and exercise authority. Concepts determine what one has committed oneself to, what one has made oneself responsible for in acting intentionally or judging. This framework leads Kant to distinguish between the realm of nature and the realm of freedom in normative terms. To be free in his sense is to be bound by norms, to be able to perform intentional actions and make judgments, which is to say, to be able to undertake commitments. That's to be able, in the normative sense of having the authority, to make oneself responsible in the ways articulated by concepts, which are rules for determining what one has committed oneself to, for instance, by calling the pen copper. One of the radical features of this normative conception of freedom as constraint by norms is that it's a conception of positive rather than negative freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from something, the absence of some sort of constraint. Positive freedom is the freedom to do something, the presence of some sort of ability or authority. In Kant's picture of the freedom characteristic of geistisch, normative beings, the capacity they have to commit themselves, to undertake responsibilities, is a kind of positive freedom. They're able to do something that merely natural creatures cannot. Freedom for Kant is the capacity to constrain oneself by something more than the laws of nature, the capacity to constrain oneself normatively by undertaking commitments and responsibilities, acknowledging authority, and so on. One way in which the model of language helps us to think about the possibility of overcoming alienation, then, is that language exhibits, an unalienated combination of the authority of individual attitudes and their responsibility to genuinely binding norms. For linguistic practice exhibits a social division of labor. It's up to each individual which speech acts to perform, which claims to make, which intentions and plans to endorse. The original source of linguistic commitments is the acts and attitudes of individual speakers. In undertaking those commitments, those speakers exercise a distinctive kind of authority. But in doing so, as an unavoidable part of doing so, they make themselves responsible to the norms that articulate the contents of the concepts that they've applied. Committing oneself in asserting or expressing an intention is licensing the rest of one's community to hold one responsible. The speaker and agent's authority is not only compatible with coordinate responsibility, that is, authority on the part of the norms administered by the community, it's unintelligible as determinately contentful apart from such responsibility. The individual has authority over the normative force, the undertaking of a commitment, only by making himself responsible to the world and to others for the content of the commitment. The positive freedom to exercise authority by undertaking determinately contentful commitments requires giving up some negative freedom by making oneself responsible. Now, unlike Kant, Hegel has a social practice account of the nature of normativity. Freedom for him is accordingly not a wholly individual achievement, not something that can be understood individual agent by agent. It's possible only in the context of communities, practices, and institutions that have the right structure. Because normativity is a social achievement, freedom is an essentially political phenomenon in a way that it isn't for Kant. This difference between the two thinkers is connected to another one. Freedom's a comparative normative phenomenon for Hegel in a way that it's not for Kant. Not everyone who is constrained by norms is free, according to Hegel. Only norm-instituting recognitive communities and institutions with the right structure constitute free, self-conscious individuals. And the paradigm of that ideal freedom-instituting structure is specifically linguistic normativity. A classic, perennial, in some sense defining problem of political philosophy has always been to explain how and on what grounds it could be rational for an individual to accept some communal constraint on her will. What could justify the loss of negative freedom, the freedom from constraint, that you get by entering into a community and subjecting yourself to their norms, acknowledging the authority of those norms? One can easily see how that could be justified from the point of view of the community. Unless people act rightly and conform to the norms, there are lots of things the community just can't do. The challenge has been to say, though, how one could justify that loss of negative freedom as rational on the part of the individual. Responses to this challenge form a favorite literary genre of the Enlightenment, maybe Hobbes and Locke or its paradigmatic practitioners. But Hegel saw in Kant's notion of positive freedom the possibility of a completely new kind of response to this challenge. In this context, the fact that language provides both the medium and the model of recognition takes on a specific importance. His idea is that some kinds of normative constraint provide a positive freedom, which in Hegel's distinctive view, and moving beyond Kant, is expressive freedom. And the model for the exercise of that sort of freedom is talking and thinking. Subsequent developments have put us in a somewhat better position to say what's promising about the linguistic model of positive freedom. Think to begin with of the astonishing empirical observation with which Noam Chomsky inaugurated modern linguistics. That was the observation that almost every sentence uttered by an adult native speaker is a novel sentence. It's radically new, not just in the sense that that speaker has never produced or heard exactly that string of words before, but in the much stronger sense that no one in the history of the world has ever heard exactly that string of words before. Have a nice day may get a lot of play, or noch ein in German. But for any tolerably complex sentence, say a sentence drawn at random from my text, the odds of anybody having uttered it before, unless specifically in quotation mode, approach the infinitesimal. This is an observation that's been empirically verified over and over again by examining large corpora, transcribing actual conversations, and so on. And it's easy to show on fundamental grounds. Although we don't have a grammar that will generate all and only the sentences of English, say, we have lots of grammars that generate only sentences of English. And if you look at how many sentences of, say, fewer than 25 words there are, even in a vocabulary of basic English, 5,000 words, where an ordinary speaker probably uses 20,000, you can see that there just hasn't been time for a measurable proportion of them to be uttered, even if everyone always spoke English and did nothing but talk. So linguistic competence is the capacity to produce and understand an indefinite number of radically novel sentences. Chomsky started modern linguistics by asking, how is that possible? How is that trick done? Well, however the trick is done, being able to do it is a kind of positive linguistic expressive freedom. The fact is that when you speak a language, you get the capacity to formulate an indefinite number of novel claims, and so to entertain an indefinite number of novel intentions, plans, and conjectures. That's a kind of positive freedom to make and entertain novel claims, things that could be true, or things one could commit oneself to making true. And one gets that explosion of positive expressive freedom only by constraining oneself by linguistic norms. The norms one must acknowledge in practice as binding in order to be speaking some particular language, and so to be speaking at all. However open-textured those norms must be, they involve genuine constraint. If one doesn't sufficiently respect the linguistic norms, one ends up not saying or thinking anything at all. Of course, one need not say anything. One could just not ever say anything, though at the cost, as Wilfrid Sellers says, of having nothing to say. But the only way you can buy this positive expressive freedom is by paying a price in negative freedom. One must constrain oneself by linguistic and conceptual norms. When one's speaking one's own language and not using fancy vocabulary, that constraint can become invisible. But it becomes much more visible when speaking in a language in which one is not fluent. The point here is that the way in which the language one does constrain oneself by becomes the medium in which one's self not only expresses but develops itself is a paradigm of central importance for Hegel. In the context of his essentially political, because social account of the nature of normativity, the paradigm of linguistic norms provides the form of an argument how it could be rational to give up some kind of negative freedom, constraining oneself by norms, making oneself and one's performance responsible to them, that is, liable to assessment according to them, by practically acknowledging them as authoritative. For consider a rational assessment of the costs and benefits of trading off some minor negative freedom for the bonanza of positive expressive freedom that comes with constraining oneself by linguistic norms. Any such assessment would have to be retrospective, of course, because anyone who hasn't yet made the deal is not in a position to rationally assess anything. But can there be any doubt that the trade-off is worth it? Even though the beasts of field and forest are not in a position to make this argument, it seems clear that it would be rational for them to embrace this sort of normative constraint if they were able to. Part of Hegel's thought about how we can move beyond modernity, and a lesson we should learn from the single biggest event in the history of Geist, the advent of modernity, is that the positive expressive freedom afforded by engaging in linguistic practices, so subjecting oneself to constraint by linguistic norms, is the paradigm of freedom for normative discursive beings like us. And that political institutions and the normative constraint they exercise should be justifiable in exactly the same way that conceptual linguistic norms are. In particular, every loss of negative freedom should be more than compensated for by an increase in positive expressive freedom. This is the capacity to undertake new kinds of commitments, new kinds of responsibility, to acknowledge and exercise new kinds of authority, all of which at once express and develop the self-conscious individuals who are the subjects of those new norms. This is a paradigm and a measure of justifiable political constraint. That's how it can be rationally legitimated, even if only retrospectively, because the positive expressive freedom in question may not, as in the paradigmatic linguistic case, be prospectively intelligible. The demand is that every aspect of the loss of negative freedom, of the constraint by norms that individuals take on, be compensated many times over by an increase in positive expressive freedom. The form of rational justification for political institutions and its immanent norms is to show that it is, in this crucial respect, language-like. Now, language is, of course, not a distinctively modern institution. There's no Geist of any kind apart from linguistic practices. But we can see that the stakes are high when Hegel specifies the distinctive role language plays in the norm-articulating recognitive structure of modernity. Rather than being just one optional form in which the force of norms can be acknowledged and their content expressed, language becomes the medium in which norms are instituted and applied. There are profound consequences to seeing the rise of subjectivity in the form of the acknowledgments of the rights of intention and knowledge on the practical side, the advent of a new kind of self-conscious individuality as bringing with it this new institutional centrality of language. Hegel's philosophy of language, his account of the relations among speakers, their acts and attitudes, the linguistic communities they belong to, and the linguistic norms that make up the language itself, and the idiom in which Hegel's account is articulated, may be the part of his thought that's of the most contemporary philosophical interest and value. And that's at least partly because he attributes a deep political significance to the replacement of a semantic model of atomistic representation by one of holistic expression. It's this line of thought that underlies the contention here and in my other work, not only that Hegel's semantic theory, his theory of conceptual content, and his pragmatist understanding of how meaning is related to the norms governing the use of expressions, that is, the practical attitudes expressed by applying concepts and judging and acting intentionally, should be thought of as at the center of Hegel's thought, but also in the idea that he's presenting a semantics that's intended to have a practically edifying effect. Because understanding how discursive practice both institutes and applies determinately contentful conceptual norms on the linguistic model is to point the way to a new and better, more fully self-conscious structure of practical normativity, a new structure of recognition itself. It's to lead to a new form of mutual recognition and to usher in the third stage in the development of Geist, the age of trust. So now I want to say something about the age of trust. Hegel had said that actual consciousness was divided into what he represents allegorically as state power and wealth. I'm not going to say anything about that discussion. But he divides pure consciousness into faith and enlightenment. Faith and enlightenment are not just theories of normativity, they're institutionalized theories. The characteristically alienated structure of modern normativity shows up not only in the relations between the competing forms of actual consciousness, but also in the relations between the competing alienated theories of normativity embodied by faith and enlightenment. That's to say that in both cases, the relations of authority and responsibility between the two substructures are practically construed on the model of pure independence, mastery, hence as competing and incompatible, rather than on the model of freedom as reciprocal and mutually presupposing. By telling us what he thinks faith is right about, what he thinks enlightenment is right about, how faith looks to enlightenment and how enlightenment looks to faith, Hegel assembles raw materials that are crucial for the transition from modernity to a form of normativity structured by self-consciousness with the form that he calls absolute knowing. In general, Hegel's reading of faith, the distinctively modern, hence alienated form of religion, is a successor project to Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, a book that had had a tremendous influence on Hegel when he was still a student at the Stift in Tübingen, as well as with his classmates Schelling and Hölderlin. Where Kant had looked for the rational moral teachings that were expressed in sensuous images in Christianity, Hegel seeks also lessons about the metaphysics of self-conscious individuality and social substance. These passages about a core structure of faith are a paradigm of how Hegel gives a metaphysical reading of religious imagery. He says, here in the realm of faith, the first is the absolute being, spirit that is in and for itself insofar as it's the simple eternal substance. But in the actualization of its notion, in being spirit, it passes over into being for another. Its self-identity becomes an actual self-sacrificing absolute being. It becomes a self, but a mortal, perishable self. Consequently, the third moment is the return of this alienated self and of the humiliated substance into their original simplicity. Only in this way is substance represented as spirit. These distinct beings, when brought back to themselves by thought out of the flux of the actual world, are immutable eternal spirits whose being lies in thinking the unity they constitute. End of the quote. This is his reading of the actual significance and metaphysical meaning of the allegory of incarnation and the Trinity. He thinks the doctrine of the Trinity is really talking about the structure of Geist, that is, of social normative substance, as he says in the passage, and that the community and the norms that are implicit in the communal doings, what he talks about as its essence, is what God the Father in the Trinity is the image of. The substance is social substance synthesized by reciprocal recognition. That's the medium in which norms inhere. In the model, it's language. The interfusion of humanity and divinity in God the Son within the allegory stands for these actual individual speakers who are bound and constituted as self-conscious individuals by those norms, as he says, passing over into being for another, becoming a self, a mortal, perishable self. The relations between them, the way in which speakers and their utterances are what they are only by virtue of the linguistic norms that govern them, and the norms are only actualized by being applied by actual utterances by speakers and audiences, that's the Holy Spirit in the image of the Trinity. So we have the universals, or norms, their perishable incarnation raised above mere particularity, which is also the actualization of those norms, and the relation between them in individuality. The lesson Hegel draws is that the being of these spirits, as he says, lies in thinking the unity that they constitute. That is, in understanding his recognitive account of normativity and individuality in relation to, on the one hand, biological particularity, and on the other, normative universality. It's a measure of the way he works that Hegel goes back and forth cheerfully between the logical vocabulary, the theological vocabulary, and the linguistic cum normative vocabulary for talking about these things. The religious language is a sensuous allegory for the most fundamental metaphysical and logical idea that Hegel has. Thinking of the universal and particular elements of individuality, the divine and the human, as standing in familial relations is construing mediation under the categories of immediacy. Universality is thought of as being a kind of thing, in many ways like the things here, only somewhere else, over there, in a beyond, jenseits, in a different ontological postcode than ours. In a corresponding and complementary approach, Enlightenment construes universality and normativity as rationality. This good thought shows up only in an alienated form, however, when rationality is then in turn thought of as a matter of factual dispositional property that happens to be shared by some particular organisms or kind of organism. When our being geistish beings is put in a box with our having opposable thumbs. The lesson of the transition in consciousness from perception to force and understanding was that the universals, the conceptual relations of incompatibility and consequence that articulate facts and show up in the form of laws, should be understood not as a supersensible world of theoretical entities standing behind and ontologically distinguished from the objects that show up in sense, but rather as the implicit structure or articulation of them, the modal articulation of observable fact. In the same way here, that's the lesson we're supposed to learn about what he insists is the common topic of faith under the heading of the religious absolute, and of enlightenment under the heading of reason. Normativity, universality, is not to be reified into some kind of thing, either over there, as in God, or even in individual human beings, as reason, but rather as implicit in the articulation of individuals in a community, their recognitive interplay, and the utterances and attitudes that actualize and express the norms. Enlightenment's critique of faith, as Hegel recounts it, shows some understanding of this lesson. As he reconstructs the critique, it's three-pronged. There's an ontological claim, an epistemological claim, and a practical moral claim. The first is that faith makes an ontological mistake. It thinks that something exists when it does not. God is not, in fact, part of the furniture of the world. Thinking there is such a being is just a generalization of pre-modern magical thinking, which sees ordinary sensible material objects as enchanted, possessed of magical properties. Generically, this mistake is of a piece with thinking that there's a tiger in the next room when the room is in fact empty. The epistemological objection of enlightenment to faith is that even if there were such an object, we couldn't come to know about it in the way faith claims to come to know about God. The actual epistemological grounds for belief in this absolute consist of prejudice, error, gullibility, confusion, and stupidity. Faith claims an immediate relation to the absolute, but in fact all the contents of its purported knowledge depend on contingent empirical claims. Reports of miracles, accidental preservation of evidence of the knowledge of those occurrences through Scripture, and correct interpretation of the text cannot critically bear the weight of the belief that's predicated on it. Third, Enlightenment accuses faith of bad intention or motivation, of practical errors of action, of immoral activity. The priests are accused of trickery, the pretense of insight and knowledge, and of using that as a means to amass power. The proof of that is the way despotism, through the doctrine of the divine right of kings, is a state power that employs the gullibility and bad insight of the masses and the trickery of the priests to establish itself. So, Enlightenment says, the ontological mistake and the epistemological mistakes of religion are put in service of bad political and moral activity, and despotism and religious institutions are two hands that wash each other. Here, Hegel has in mind the radical Enlightenment attitude that's summed up pithily by Denis Diderot when he says that he'll only be happy when the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest. Hegel responds to these familiar telling complaints that Enlightenment is fundamentally misunderstanding faith by seeing it as, in the first instance, standing in a cognitive relation to something, as consisting at base in a claim to knowledge of the absolute. The criticisms as to evidence, the ungenerous attribution of ignoble motives for promulgating this belief, all these things depend on seeing faith as making a matter-of-factual claim about how things are, about which we can then ask for its epistemological credentials, and about the matter-of-factual truth or falsity of the claim. For Hegel, faith is in the first instance a matter of realizing a certain self-conception. It's not a kind of cognition, it's a kind of recognition, and therefore a kind of self-constitution. Generically, it's the identification of the individual self with the universal rather than with its particular aspect. That identification with the universal takes the allegorical form of sacrificing particular subjective attitudes and interests through service and worship. In the original melodramatic allegorical picture of the transition from nature to spirit, the first masters pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps out of the muck of nature by being willing to risk their biological lives for a normative status, for a form of authority, to be recognized as having that normative status by being willing, if necessary, to die to be so recognized. The point of the allegory of the sacrifice of service and worship is rather to identify with the authority of the norms, the universal, by being willing to live for it, by submerging particular attitudes, beliefs and desires, in the communal norms. In that way, like the master of the original allegory, believing consciousness succeeds in making itself something other than what it already was. It constitutes itself as something more than that. That existential self-constitution, institution of a normative status by adoption of an attitude, is for Hegel what faith really consists in. The reason the criticisms of faith by Enlightenment miss their mark on this account is that the self-conception to which a community is in this way practically committed to realizing is not the having of a belief that could turn out to be radically false. It doesn't stand in that sort of relation to its world. It's a doing, a making things be thus and so, not a taking of them to be thus and so. It's a recognition, a kind of self-constitution, not a kind of cognition. What it's about, the truth that the certainty of the believer is answerable to, is not something distinct from the believer in the community. It's something that if all goes well, the believers make true of themselves. And if not, the failure is practical, not cognitive. Faith for the believer, Hegel tells us, is not an alien thing that's just found in him, no one knowing how and whence it came. On the contrary, the faith of the believer consists just in him finding himself as this particular personal consciousness in the absolute being, and in his obedience, and his obedience and service consist in producing through his own activity that being as his own absolute being. Hegel says, but here enlightenment is foolish. Faith regards it as not understanding the real facts when it talks about priestly deception and deluding the people. It talks about this as if by some hocus pocus of conjuring priests, consciousness has been pawned off with something absolutely alien and other to it in place of its own essence. It's impossible to deceive a people in this manner. Brass instead of gold, counterfeit instead of genuine money may well be passed off, at least in isolated cases. Many may be persuaded to believe that a battle lost was a battle won, and other lies about things of sense and isolated happenings may be credible for a time. But in the knowledge of that essential being in which consciousness has immediate certainty of itself, the idea of this sort of delusion is quite out of the question. End of the quote. The language of belief is performative, establishing as well as expressing social normative relations, not just saying how things objectively are, independently of the attitudes of the believers involved. What's constituted by faith is a certain kind of self-conscious individuality. The recognitive account of self-consciousness tells us that this is possible only if a corresponding kind of recognitive community is instituted at the same time. The religious community is established by individuals' reciprocal recognition of each other as serving and worshiping, which is to say, as identifying with the norms through sacrifice of merely particular subjective attitudes and interests of individuals that they would otherwise be. This recognitive relation, Hegel calls trust, Vertrauen. He says, whomsoever I trust, his certainty of himself is for me the certainty of myself. I recognize in him my own being for self, know that he acknowledges it, and that it is for him purpose and essence. End of the quote. The second part of that passage puts three requirements for an attitude to count as trust. The trusting one must recognize her own being for self, her own self-conception in the trusted one. The trusting one must correctly take it that that self-conception is acknowledged, recognized by the trusted one. And the trusted one must correctly take it that that self-conception is acknowledged by the trusting one as also her own. The first part of the passage says that when those conditions are met, the trusting individual counts as identifying with the trusted individual. It's a form of recognition. So there's a kind of emergent identification through recognition here, according to which identifying with the norms has the effect or significance of identifying with other individuals, who also identify their individual selves with the norms. Identifying with, by sacrificing attitudes for, the norms, and recognizing other individuals as doing the same, is at once identifying with the communal side of Geist, the recognitive community, in whose practices the norms are implicit, and also identifying with the other individuals whom one recognizes as undertaking the same kind of identification. One is not identifying with the norms or the community, but rather with the other individuals, but identifying with each by identifying with the others. Or put another way, because of the shared renunciation of particular attitudes, the individuals one identifies with by recognizing them as identifying with the community and its norms are not being treated in practice as split into a particular and a universal aspect. This constellation of attitudes foreshadows the final fully self-conscious form of mutual recognition. In trust, everyone is identifying with the universal side of individuality and thereby with others who also do so. The passage I quoted a minute ago continues. Further, since what is object for me is that in which I recognize myself, I am for myself at the same time in that object in the form of another self-consciousness, i.e. one which has become in that object alienated from its particular individuality, viz. From its natural and contingent existence, but which partly remains therein self-consciousness, partly in that object is an essential consciousness. End of the quote. The community synthesized by reciprocal recognition in the form of trust shows the way to the possibility of an unalienated community of self-conscious individuals. It doesn't yet constitute such a community because the particularity of the actual individual self-consciousnesses that actualize the norms by their acts and attitudes, including their recognitive attitudes, is still slighted. Further recognitive progress is required to overcome alienation and move beyond the modern phase in the development of Geist. Unalienated Geist requires further recognitive structure beyond trust as it's on offer at this point. But that the recognitive community have the structure of trust in this sense is one essential element of Sittlichkeit after the rise of modern subjectivity. What trust brings about is what Hegel calls the unity of abstract essence and self-consciousness, of the norms believing individuals identify with and those believers. That unity, Hegel claims, is the absolute being of faith, that is, the distinctive object of religious belief. He says, quote, "The absolute being of faith is essentially not the abstract essence that would exist beyond the consciousness of the believer. On the contrary, it's the spirit of the community, the unity of the abstract essence and the self-consciousness. It's the spirit of the community, the unity of the abstract essence in self-consciousness." End of the quote. On his view, the real object of religious veneration, Geist, is not a God in the form of a distinct thing that causally creates human beings, but the religious community that the believers create by their recognitive identification with it and with each other. That, after all, is the lesson of his reading of the Christian Trinity. God the Father is the sensuously clothed image of the norm-governed community synthesized by reciprocal recognitive attitudes, when they have the structure of trust, among self-conscious individuals. The spiritual dimension of human life, towards which religious believers properly direct their attention and respect, is what must be added to merely natural animals to make us persons, self-conscious individual selves, agents and knowers, subjects of normative assessment. And that is the discursive normativity implicit in the practices of a properly constituted recognitive community of language users. Even though its achievement of a community exhibiting the recognitive structure of trust is a positive development, faith, as Hegel describes it, is still an alienated form of self-consciousness. It's alienated in that it does not suitably and self-consciously incorporate the particular element in its practical attitude towards individuality. It is in fact the activity of individuals that produce the community and its implicit norms. Further, the relation of each believing individual to that for which it sacrifices and with which it identifies, the object of its veneration, is mediated by its relations to other recognized and recognizing individuals via those recognitive attitudes. But faith insists rather that it stands in an immediate relation to an absolute essence, and that the existence and nature of that essence is wholly independent of the attitudes and activities of believers. Whereas in fact, quote, that the absolute being of faith be the spirit of the community, this requires as a necessary moment the action of the community. It is this spirit only by being produced by consciousness, or rather it does not exist as the spirit of the community without having been produced by this consciousness. End of the quote. Its norms are actually the product of its practical recognitive attitudes. Modernity is right about that, and faith doesn't understand itself this way. Hegel's been telling us what the object of faith is in itself, not what it is for the kind of consciousness in question. He's describing for us the referent that they pick out, address themselves to, by means of misleading senses or conceptual contents. He's been talking about the noumena behind the phenomena of religious worship and service. In this respect, Enlightenment is right in its criticisms of faith. Faith does seriously misunderstand its object, which is not, as faith thinks, an objective independent being, but a product of its own thought and practice. Making a mistake of this kind is what in Marx's anthropological allegory is called fetishism. Hegel says, it's just this that Enlightenment rightly declares faith to be, when it says that what is for faith the absolute being is a being of its own consciousness, is its own thought, something that's a creation of consciousness itself. End of the quote. Faith seeks to ground its recognitive and practical activities in the knowledge of facts. That is, to give an objectivist metaphysical grounding for the bindingness of these norms. That meta-attitude is carried over from traditional society, thinking of the norms not as the products of our activity, but as something merely found in the way the world anyway is. Where for the Greeks the norms had been part of the natural world, for faith they're part of the supernatural world. But that's a specific difference within a general agreement, that norms are grounded in ontology and matters of fact, in something about how the world just is, antecedently to having human beings and their practical attitudes in it. Those norms and their bindingness are not understood as products of human attitudes and activity, though they in fact are instituted by people acting according to the pure consciousness of faith. Believers institute those norms by their attitudes, but they don't understand themselves as doing that. Faith has not embraced the fundamental defining insight of modernity, the attitude dependence of normative statuses. Faith and enlightenment each has both a cognitive theoretical dimension and a recognitive practical dimension. Faith is wrong in its cognitive attitudes, misunderstanding its object and its relation to that object. But it succeeds with its recognitive practices, creating a community of trust. Enlightenment is right in its cognitive attitudes, correctly seeing that the normativity both are concerned with is not something independent of our attitudes and activities. But it fails on the recognitive practical side. Because it requires a community with the reciprocal recognitive structure of trust, faith acknowledges norms that can have some determinate content. They're contentful norms because a community like that can actually institute, sustain, and develop determinately contentful conceptual norms. But enlightenment creates no such community. On the cognitive side, it sees that contentful norms cannot simply be read off the way the world simply is, independently of the attitudes, activities, practices, and capacities of the creatures who are bound by those norms. Rationality is a thoroughly human capacity. But enlightenment, Hegel thinks, is stuck with a purely formal notion of reason. It can criticize the contents faith purports to find, but it can't on its own produce replacements. Enlightenment acknowledges, as faith does not, that both the binding force and the determinate content of conceptual norms depend on the activity of self-conscious individual knowers and agents. Its disenchanted, objective natural world does not come with a normative structure. The phenomena of authority and responsibility are, for enlightenment, a human imposition, the product of our attitudes and practices. Enlightenment manifests its alienation by developing its understanding of the norms in a way that's as one-sidedly subjective as faith's is one-sidedly objective. The ultimately unsatisfactory result, Hegel thinks, is Enlightenment utilitarianism, which construes the normative significance of things as consisting in their usefulness for our practical attitudes. Utility here is allegorical for the role things play as the objects of practical attitudes. This view radicalizes the insight that conceptual norms are not independent of the activities of self-conscious individuals who apply those concepts in judgment and intention. He says, the useful is the object insofar as self-consciousness penetrates it. But it turns that into the view that norms are simply reflections of particular contingent purposes and attitudes of individual self-consciousnesses. In Hegel's terms, the principle of utility identifies what the norms are in themselves with whatever they are for consciousness. The term utilitarianism is now usually used to refer to the sort of moral theory given its classic shape by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. The term typically used to refer to the extension of that way of thinking from the practical realm to the theoretical realm of theories of meaning and truth is pragmatism. Hegel sees a trajectory of thought that begins with the extrusion of subjective values from the objective world of facts and ends with an identification of all properties and facts as purpose relative, an understanding of the truth of claims as conduciveness to the success of the practical enterprises of individuals. Alienation is his term for the common practical conception of attitudes towards authority and responsibility, Hegel's independence and dependence, that underlies, motivates, and necessitates the oscillation between one-sided objectivism and one-sided subjectivism. When that alienated practical conception is made theoretically explicit, he calls it Verstand. Hegel's overall philosophical aim is to give us the metaconceptual tools to get beyond the ways of understanding norms that require us to choose between taking them to be genuinely binding on individual attitudes because objectively they're, antecedently to and independently of any such attitudes, on the one hand, and taking them to be mere reflections of those subjective attitudes, on the other. Thinking in terms of the metacategories of Vernunft instead of Verstand is to enable us to overcome not only the naive, dogmatic, ontological objectivism about norms of the tradition, but also the sort of utilitarian pragmatism with its ironic distancing from the genuineness of the binding force of norms, which Hegel thinks has been the modern culmination of the rise of subjectivism. And Hegel thinks the practical stakes riding on this enterprise are high. When pure consciousness in the form of enlightenment is the self-understanding of actual consciousness in the institutional form of state power, the practical recognitive expression and actualization of a theoretical cognitive view, the result is the terror, whose epitome is the final bloodthirsty death throes of the French Revolution. Hegel says, consciousness has found its notion, its Begriff, in utility. From this inner revolution, there emerges the actual revolution of the actual world, the new shape of consciousness, absolute freedom. End of the quote. Norms that are products of subjective attitudes are practically understood as unable to constrain those attitudes. A purely formal notion of reason offers no determinate content. The state's understood on the model of a particular individual self-consciousness, distinguished only in that the will of that consciousness, the will of the people, its commitments are taken as binding on every actual biological individual. So individuals are obliged to identify with and sacrifice themselves for that will. But that sort of purely formal recognition relation, each citizen recognizing himself in the will of all, the common will, cannot in fact institute a determinately contentful common will. That would require that the particular subjective commitments of the individuals have some sort of authority over the universal, the common will. The result, Hegel thinks, must be a content vacuum, which can be filled only by the subjective attitudes and inclinations of despotic individuals. In much the same way as in the realm of abstract legal personhood that he's told us about for the Roman Empire. Absolute terror is what happens when the authority of individual self-consciousness to institute norms is conceived in practice as unconstrained by correlative responsibility, as a matter of independence without correlative dependence. It's a pure form of mastery. Contentful norms require incorporation of particularity and contingency in the form of necessity, that is, in the normative form, and universality, conceptual content rather than normative force, through recognitive relations of reciprocal authority and responsibility, articulated not only socially, but historically, in the form of constraint by a recollected tradition. Understanding that there are no norms wholly independent of the attitudes and practices of individual self-consciousnesses is modern. Understanding that authority of attitudes over statuses on the model of unconstrained pure independence, asymmetrical recognition rather than freedom, using the model of pure independence or mastery, is alienated. Any such conception is bound to oscillate between seeing the norms as not constraining the attitudes because they're contentless, and seeing them as not constraining attitudes because their content is arbitrary, contingent, and particular, hence irrational, derived from the contingent attitudes, interests, and inclinations of some particular subject. The charge of contentlessness was Hegel's objection at the end of Reason to what he called the honest consciousness, which pursued a contraction strategy for construing agency on the model of mastery, by taking responsibility only for what it tries to do, for its will, narrowly construed, rather than for its actual doing. And near the end of Spirit, the same objection is made to what he calls the conscientious consciousness, which analogously identifies duty with what it sincerely takes to be duty. It identifies the normative status with a normative attitude. Faith and enlightenment are each one-sided appreciations of the true nature of norms in relation to attitudes. Faith is on the right track in the practical recognitive dimension of self-consciousness, but has the wrong theoretical cognitive take on the side of consciousness. Faith is right in what it does, to give the norms determinate content by building a recognitive community. It builds a community of trust, which can develop and sustain determinately contentful norms. It's right to see that its relation to the norms should be one of acknowledgement and service. It's wrong to think that private conceptions and concerns must or even can be totally sacrificed to make that possible. Faith is wrong also to take over the traditional immediate conception of its relation to the norms, to reify, ontologize, and in a sense naturalize them by objectifying them. It does not recognize itself in those norms that it identifies with, in that it does not see them as its own product. Neither its community nor its individual activities are seen as essential or authoritative with respect to those norms. Enlightenment is right that the norms depend both for their force and their content on the attitudes and practices of the very individuals who become more than merely particular natural beings by being acculturated, that is, by being constrained by those norms. It's wrong to think, enlightenment is wrong to think, that all we contribute is the form. And it's wrong in the practical recognitive consequences of its insight into our authority over the norms. It's right in its criticism of faith's metaphysics, but wrong to think that that undercuts its form of life. On the recognitive side of constituting communities and self-conscious individuals, the contrast between the terror and the community of trust could not be more stark. The division of legitimating pure consciousness into complementary, competing, practically institutionalized rivals, one of whom can be successful on the cognitive side only at the cost of failure on the recognitive side, and the other of whom can only be successful on the recognitive side at the cost of failure on the cognitive side, is the structure distinctive of modern institutional alienation. What's needed to overcome it is to combine the humanistic metaphysics of enlightenment with its theoretical cognitive emphasis on the contribution of the activity of individual self-consciousnesses with the community of trust of faith, with its practical recognitive emphasis on the contribution of the activity of individual self-consciousnesses through acknowledgement of and service to identification through sacrifice with the norms. The recipe for moving to the third postmodern phase in the development of Geist is to bring together the cognitive and recognitive successes of enlightenment and faith. The key to doing that, I'm going to argue, is appreciating the role that recollection plays in both cognition and recognition. When cognitive activity takes the form of forgiving recollection, it institutes semantic representational relations between knowing subjects and objects known. When recognitive activity takes the form of forgiving recollection, it institutes communities with the normative structure of trust. In short, recollection as forgiveness forges the conceptual link between unalienated cognition and unalienated recognition. But that's a story for another day.